What a strange drowsiness possesses them.
It is the quality of the climate.
Why doth it not then our eyelids sink? I find not myself disposed to sleep.
Nor I. My spirits are nimble. They fell together all as by consent. They dropped as by a thunderstroke. What might, worthy Sebastian?
Oh, what might?
No more. And yet, methinks I see it in thy face. What thou shouldst be, the occasion speaks thee, and my strong imagination sees a crown dropping upon thy head.
What, art thou waking?
Do you not hear me speak?
I do, and surely it is a sleepy language, and thou speakst out of thy sleep. What is it thou didst say? This is a strange repose, to be asleep with eyes wide open, standing, speaking, moving, and yet so fast asleep.
Thou lett'st thy fortune sleep, die rather, wing'st, whilst thou art waking.
Thou dost snore distinctly. There's meaning in thy snores.
I am more serious than my custom. You must be so too. If heed me, which to do trebles thee o'er.
Well, I am standing water.
I'll teach you how to flow.
Do so. To ebb, hereditary sloth instructs me.
Ebbing men, indeed, most often do so near the bottom run by their own fear or sloth.
Prithee, say on.
Say this were death that now hath seized them, they were no worse than now they are. There be that can rule Naples as well as he that sleeps, lords that can prate as amply and unnecessarily as this Gonzalo. Oh, that you bore the mind that I do, what a sleep were this for your advancement. Do you understand me?
Methinks I do. I remember. You did supplant your brother Prospero.
True. My brother's servants were then my fellows. Now, they are my men.
But for your conscience.
Aye, sir. Where lies that? If 'twere a kibe, 'twould put me to my slipper. I feel not this deity in my bosom. Here lies your brother. No better than the earth he lies upon, if he were that, which now he's like. That's dead, whom I, with this obedient steel, 3 inches of it, can lay to bed for ever. Whilst you, doing thus, to the perpetual wink for eye, might put this ancient morsel, this Sir Prudence, who should not upbraid our course.
Thy case, dear friend, shall be my precedent. As thou gottest Milan, I'll come by Naples. Draw thy sword. One stroke shall free thee from the tribute which thou payest, and I, the king, shall love thee.
Draw together.
I want to ask you about what I consider to be one of the most extraordinary duets in all of Shakespeare. It's the sequence in which Antonio convinces Sebastian that the two of them together should murder Sebastian's brother, the King of Naples, Alonso, and his advisor, his consigliere, his Polonius, you might say, and that's Gonzalo. His argument is that now you see them asleep, it's for us to arrange for them to stay asleep. What's the difference? What's the big deal?
Right.
There they are on the ground. They're of no more value than the ground itself.
Right.
That, to me, on some cosmic scale, is the limit of human depravity. Who's going to miss them? We'll fill their places. Don't worry about it.
Right.
That, to me, is on the level of Edmund plotting the murder of his own brother and father in King Lear.
Yeah, it seems worse than Edmund, who at least realizes that at one point that he has to suppress his conscience. Right? There's even in this scene, there's no sense that, I mean, conscience comes up, but it's not taken really into account. Their deaths will be, meaningless, and it's merely incidental, right?
And when Sebastian says, well, what about conscience? He says, what's that? If it were a kibe, it would put me to my slipper. If it were a corn, I'd wear something to soften my step. But
Right.
I feel not this deity in my bosom. There is no conscience. You don't have to have one if you don't want one.
There's a continuity with this scene between so many of the plays, right? Where, especially the history plays, where brothers are killing brothers, and we think of Macbeth, right, is another place where clearly Macbeth does have significant qualms of conscience after the fact and even before.
Macbeth really does foresee everything.
Right.
Harold Bloom calls it a proleptic imagination. He knows in advance
Yeah.
that he's going to be tortured, he's going to feel guilty, he's
Yeah.
going to have, and she's just saying, we just do it.
Yeah.
He can see the guilt. He can predict the nightmares.
No, he does know all of it, doesn't he? And he does it anyway. Yeah, it's interesting. And knows what he's doing. But here,
It's not only the appealing to Sebastian's sense of thwarted ambition, his sense of thwarted deserts. It's Antonio's argument, his strategy, which is to say, they're asleep. What's the difference? Dead? Alive? They'd be the same. It's two guys lying there with their eyes closed.
yeah, I think they're even more depraved, right? Because there's a kind of sophistry, right, of denying that human lives have any value at all. That's a troubling, justifying argument, right, that even some of Shakespeare's other villains don't make. Right? They recognize that there might be claims of conscience that would dictate that they not do this, right? Even Richard III has that moment, right, where he realizes, almost begins to develop some kind of conscience when his defeat is imminent, and has a sense that, who would not condemn me for the things that I've done. But it seems here like it's even greater depravity, right? It's evil denying that it's evil, right? It in a sense, right, or that. Denying life has any value in order to justify this grab for power. So I agree, and then I guess that's even more troubling that they survive with the possibility of committing these acts again.
Well, that's what makes me worry about the voyage home.
When everybody else is asleep, when Prospero's asleep or somebody, what's going to happen?
But I like what you've said, that from the point of view of moral conscience, the Macbeths are superior to Sebastian and Antonio.
Yeah, they don't have it at all. It reminds me of also, I believe it's a debate between the two individuals who are hired to kill Clarence in Richard III.
Right, the murderers.
Murderer 1 and Murderer 2. One of them, when they arrive, sort of announces that he has qualms of conscience. And the other says, well, your qualms will be answered by the purse, essentially the money that you'll get by committing this act. And it's a similar problem dramatized. One of them has no conscience, the other does. But the cynicism of the one who doesn't have a conscience is simply, you'll profit by it, so that will be enough recompense for whatever conscience you feel. And then, of course, they both do kill Clarence, right? Other examples of that, the way Iago manipulates Rodrigo, right? It's also, someone who's cleverer, more clever, right? Sort of manipulating somebody who's kind of dull-witted, right, is another aspect of it, right, where he can be sort of convinced by this flimsy argument. He's not thoughtful.
Not all of Shakespeare's characters are brilliant. They're not all Nobel laureates.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, Rodrigo, for example, in Othello is a fool, right? He's not bright. Iago tells him, at least he asks Iago, right, if he hasn't given you the position, why do you serve him, right? And I serve him to serve my turn upon him, right? Is Iago's response. Right in Act 1, Scene 1, we're told by Iago exactly what he is, that he serves only himself. And then Rodrigo trusts him. He has to be stupid, right? Because we're told so directly by Iago that he's only serving himself, right? He's only trying to line his coat. And that's the only thing that's valuable, right? Put money in thy purse. And if Rodrigo had any ounce of intelligence, he would realize that this is somebody who's absolutely untrustworthy. Yet he foolishly believes him at every turn, you know? So I think there are more characters like that in Shakespeare who are just not too bright, yeah. And they can be manipulated into doing horrific things by flawed and flimsy arguments.
You could probably say that mercy, forgiveness, love, that in Shakespeare it might endure, but it does not necessarily conquer all. There are these unregenerate natures, levels of ambition that are not accessible by mercy and love.
I think so. I think what he's suggesting is that evil exists. That, I mean, he's kind of an unflinching examination that, yeah, mercy and forgiveness exist and they have an enduring value, but there are still the unredeemable, right? And maybe it's presented in a less troubling light because it's a romance and because everything's resolved. But nonetheless, there's still ironies. Of course, one of the important passages is when Miranda sees them. She says, "O brave new world that has such men in it." But that's fraught with irony because some of these men have plotted to murder. And so there's no way that statement is not undercut by an irony, right? The new world is the same as the old one, right, in a sense. And I think Shakespeare may even be making that comment about, this exploration of new worlds, that you're going to find the same things there, right? You might find mercy and forgiveness, but you also can find individuals who lack conscience completely. They appear to be quite pathological, right? In the sense that language that we would use today.
Shakespeare seems to be aware of the fact that whatever your personal development might lead you to, or whatever satori, whatever enlightenment you have, it
right,
doesn't necessarily affect anyone else. The world goes on. There are unregenerate natures that your transformation is not going to work its magic on.
Yeah, I mean, he has other characters like that in romance, right, who are punished, actually, right? So Cloten in Cymbeline, right? I mean, he winds up literally losing his head, right? And there's we're not intended to feel any remorse, right? He's a thoroughly despicable character. He's spectacularly unheroic, and it doesn't really register too much that he's suffered this fate because he deserves it. But he doesn't do a similar thing here with these characters, right? And they're left alive to potentially do harm.
And Antonio and Sebastian are not really punished, are they, for what they've plotted to do?
Yeah, they're just carrying on, right? Yeah, it's interesting. There doesn't seem to be any punishment for that at all, right? Although they never actually do anything.
No, it's a conspiracy.
It's a conspiracy. You could be punished for that, right? But still, their natures are such that they can and might do such a thing.
But we already know of what Antonio is capable. He's already put his brother out to sea with his infant daughter. Mm-hmm. And he's been having a good time as the Duke.
Yeah, well, he's done something. Although he stopped short of killing him.
Well, we could say that it's close enough to attempted murder if you're putting an infant into a dingy old launch and shoving her out into the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it's more or less effectively killing him. Yeah, that's true.
Why do you think Shakespeare does not develop any sense of remorse, any need for forgiveness in either of these men? And yet we see it in so many of his characters. We see it in Hotspur. We see it in Laertes. We even see it in Lady Macbeth, often it happens as a character is dying. They regret what they've done. Please forgive me.
Yeah.
And yet at the conclusion of the Tempest, it's the same two men. We saw them plotting against Gonzalo and Alonso. Now we see them plotting to kidnap Caliban, take him back home, make some big bucks off of this crazy bastard.
Right.
It's almost like a scene from The Elephant Man.
Right.
So they don't appear to have appreciated Prospero's pardon or to have mended their ways at all.
But I suppose, what would Prospero have left to do to manage the state if there weren't such individuals that needed to be managed, right? If he's going to need those skills of leadership and exercise them, well, then I suppose it means knowing when to deliver mercy and when not to, right? So, political life assumes the existence of such individuals, perhaps, right? That there's maybe a layer of realism there in not tying up that loose end.
What kind of a duke, I wonder, will Prospero be when he returns to Milan?
I think that we're led to assume that he will be a better ruler, that he won't neglect the affairs of state, and that he's also taking care of his succession as well. So there won't be any instability in the wake of his demise because he's assured a arrangement that will allow for a peaceful succession, which is endemic to a lot of plays, that problem, right? Most of the history ones are about succession and peaceful succession from one ruler to the other. King Lear certainly meditates on that, all right? But Prospero has effectively taken care of that as well. So he'll rule well, and he'll be succeeded by two virtuous individuals who presumably will do well also, and whom he's educated and will educate, right? In the and provide guidance in the rule of the state.
Interesting, we never hear how well or how badly Antonio managed as Duke of Milan.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, not there at all, right?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Presumably in a way that didn't have him deposed, right? But that could be ruthlessly Machiavellian too, right?
Right.
The kind of leadership that Machiavelli advocates, right? Which is one of the questions, I think, still at play.
And you did say that that's a Machiavellian personality on the part of Antonio. It does have those characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Although Prospero does have characteristics of manipulation as well. So I think that Shakespeare is allowing for a kind of Machiavellianism that may actually not be a bad thing.
He even puts his own daughter to sleep when Prospero just wants her to be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of control.
Yeah, it is a lot of control. Yeah, I think you can question whether or not he's benevolent too. Absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah. There are questions about character that are left open, right? I think that's also important in relationship to the white magic, dark magic issue, right? How is power used and how does it relate to a person's character, right? We're encouraged to see Prospero as somebody of good character, I think. And, therefore he's willing to consider mercy because he has a good character, right? Otherwise he wouldn't even consider it. He would just protect himself ruthlessly, right? Which would probably be the more Machiavellian approach, right? Even in not necessarily in a pejorative sense of the term, these are already individuals who have proven themselves to be villains. He's a king, right? He could legitimately decree death for them and still be within the bounds of justice, right? They've done wrong. They may not be redeemable. So I think questions of character, occur as well. And Shakespeare's investigating them, in Tempest.
Imagine a student who has finished reading the Tempest and wants only to know what Shakespeare is saying about political power. How would you summarize it for him or her?
I think it's a reflection on the responsible use of political power, and that, to go back to magic as a metaphor for power, I think that Shakespeare's reflecting on the problem of whether or not political power has a capacity for good. I think in a lot of his work, he moves in the direction of a kind of cynicism about political power, right? Or at least an attitude of profound suspicion. And in Prospero, we actually see a good ruler, or someone who's become a good ruler, exercising absolute power over individuals without harming them. And I think that Shakespeare's investigation and concern with monarchy, and the way he often interrogates what rulers have done, and the bloodthirstiness of rulers in pursuit of power, and the question he raises in the history plays about the ruthlessness of politics, all come out in Prospero in a figure who may, on one reading, be capable of exercising power justly. And I think Shakespeare meditates on that over and over again, whether or not power and justice are commensurate with one another, whether they can ever be commensurate. To me, it also, because it seems like if you're to have mercy on someone, you must have some kind of empathy for them. And I think that Shakespeare, moves into an investigation of that question as well. And often he shows how empathy seems to only be able to exist on the margins of power, that those who wield it often appear to lack it, right? And the times when individuals are capable of showing mercy, those who have power are showing mercy, even then sometimes it's ambiguous, right? In Merchant of Venice, right, the Christian heroes in that play, appear to show mercy on Shylock, but it doesn't really seem like mercy, right? Forcing him to convert, right? It's problematic, their mercy, right? And they've already reviled Shylock. They've already generated the resentment in him that's responsible for, his anger. And his desire for revenge, and it's completely plausible why he would develop it. So I think that Shakespeare's work tends ultimately to the develop of this questioning of how mercy fits in with power, how empathy fits in with power. I constantly find myself returning to King Lear on this one, right? And there's a wonderful little passage where Edgar has encountered Lear, and in witnessing Lear's suffering, he expresses this notion of empathy, right? Something that there's really not a word for in Shakespeare's day, right? There's it's Hume who develops the concept of empathy, really, but I think Shakespeare, of course, it doesn't bar him from recognizing it. And he says, when we are better see bearing our woes, we scarcely think our miseries our foes. He alone suffers most in the mind, leaving good things and happy scenes behind. But the mind much sufferance doth overskip, when grief hath mates and bearing fellowship. And it's clearly, I think what Shakespeare's suggesting is that when a person suffers, the worst part of that suffering is if they have to bear it alone, right? But the mind much sufferance doth overskip, when grief hath mates and bearing fellowship. To me, I think that's one of Shakespeare's more profound insights, and it relates to mercy in some way. It relates to the exercise of political power. I think it would relate to, it would be I think it'd be compelling for anybody who's politically engaged to see how, politically engaged in terms of political causes, right? They always are informed, I think, by an empathy for those who are excluded or marginalized, underprivileged, right? Why would you take up such a position if not from a perspective of some kind of empathy for them, right? Even Lear, when Lear sees Edgar in the guise of poor Tom, realizes, I have to pay some mind to this, right? Once Lear is stripped of everything, he arrives at a kind of perspective that includes this kind of empathy, right? We see Lear giving a piece of cheese to a mouse, right, and saying, "Here, this is better," right? Suddenly, the lowliest creature is on his radar screen, and so I think that's what's compelling. It's what's compelling in the Tempest as well, since Prospero does exhibit a kind of mercy, right, as well, which has a relationship to empathy. So I kind of answered a question about Lear, but I think that also that knowledge, that wisdom applies in the Tempest as well. Even though I think he recognizes there's the other side is, of course, just the exercise of power by those who have it in self-serving ways that don't really benefit anybody except themselves. That's Iago and Edmund and many of the villains, right? They're focused on their own pleasure. They're focused on their own goals that are independent of any kind of common good, or doesn't really come into consideration for them. And that's usually shown to be completely destructive. But Prospero, I think, is a much more ambiguous character, right? There are interesting moments, though, where he is manipulating. He does exercise that power sometimes cruelly. For example, how he exercises it with Caliban, right? Both at certain points appears to have justification, and at other points doesn't, right? He scolds Caliban right in the opening act, right? Because of the fact that he presumably wants to rape Miranda, and Caliban's response is, well, if you hadn't stopped me, I would have already populated this island with sons. But we do learn later how much he's tortured Caliban. And of course, one of the passages that fascinates me is when Caliban complains, right, to Miranda. Actually, there's one passage where he complains to Miranda about having taught him to speak, so he only knows better how to curse, right? But the other one is when he describes how Prospero gave him the grapes to drink, which of course must be wine. And this is where the grapes being wine leads to this being a critique of colonialism, right? Prospero being a colonialist who is given alcohol to, for example, I guess the most salient comparison would be to Native Americans, right?
Right.
And that the alcohol is used to tame them. So I think those who don't want to take the tact of seeing it as wine are probably not sympathetic to the colonialist interpretation of the text, because it points in the direction of Prospero being much less virtuous than, the good king who uses good magic to bring about this positive resolution to conflicts. I think Caliban is virtually ignored at the end of this story, right? He's left on the island, presumably, right? Is no longer relevant as they're returning, right? To Europe. So I think that there are different readings of this. Both of them can be upheld, but to not consider that possibility when so clearly Shakespeare's responding to stories of travel to the New World, and has read Montaigne's essay, understands the kind of relativist standpoint that Montaigne presents, I don't see how you can't at least consider it as a possibility. He is used to do all the labor, right? Prospero's not doing the labor himself. He wants to be free, but there's also the question of what he'll do if he's free. And given his status as kind of subhuman, right? There's a fear that if he's given his freedom, that he might do something destructive, right? That he has to be guided. He has to be given this constant guidance. He can only be educated so far. If you really think about it, that is the perception that slaveholders have of their slaves, right? And so there is something there to really consider, that Prospero's perspective is really no different from a slave owner, right? Who believes that his slaves have a limited intellectual capacity for learning, and will always need to be overseen and watched because they're not capable of higher forms of civilization, whatever they may be, whatever you want to call those things, right? Ariel, on the other hand, is also otherworldly, right? And also there's a sense that the power that Ariel wields could be destructive as well. And Prospero doesn't quite trust him, right? He says, well, I think at one point he suggests to him that your power could easily be used for bad as well as good, right? And reminds him, right, of the fact that he freed him, so he has this obligation to freed him from the tree, so he has this obligation to serve him. So they're both slaves, right, for different reasons to Prospero.
I know that one of your concerns in approaching Shakespeare is the chaos that almost inevitably ensues after a statesman has been deposed. You see it throughout the course of the history plays, and I'm wondering whether or not you could apply this to the Tempest. He's only a duke, but in fact Prospero has been unlawfully deposed, and it does not ultimately work out all that well for Antonio or for Alonso. They end up shipwrecked and at the mercy of the deposed, at the mercy of Prospero.
Right. And Shakespeare's time was racked by rebellion and instability. Even the 200 years preceding it, right, with the War of the Roses, right, and more than 200 years, right, would have been a period of instability after instability, right, as people are deposed and new monarchs take the throne.